Here is why Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen are going to be fired. What is going on, guys? The Inside the Booth podcast, and today we are talking about Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen as if they should be fired after this season or should they be allowed another year. We are going to talk about it all, but before we do that, leave a like, leave a follow, and let's get right into this, talking about Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen primarily. And here's the thing, right? Jackson Dart has looked good, right? And that was Brian Daboll's decision to start Jackson Dart in Week 4 against the Los Angeles Chargers. And they won the football game, right? They looked good. They scored a bunch of touchdowns. Jackson Dart had his own rushing touchdown. And the team looked really good, right? And that is one of the reasons why I do think that Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, stay. I don't think they're firing one and keeping the other. I don't. And I think I've said that multiple times on this channel. They are a dual package, and they always will be. And I think just the overall commitment between those two has been pretty tight. I think these guys are going to stay together, like I just said. And here's the other thing as well. The problem that I have with this team, and honestly this fan base, is the amount of times they just want the coach fired because things are not going well and they might have another losing season. You have to lose a lot before you win big. And I say that with, pretty high intentions, right? This is a team that has had a lot of bad seasons, right? I mean, I get it. It's been 10 plus years since they've won a Super Bowl, and you're going to be like, how much is enough, right? How much losing is enough? Look at the amount of coaches that you've hired that have not had any success, right? Joe Judge was always a special teams guy, could never handle the big time role. Ben McAdoo, Pat Shurmur, all of those guys, not good enough. Not good enough. At least I feel with Brian Daboll is that, yes, he had that great 2022 season where they made the playoffs 9-8, were able to win a road playoff game for the first time in many years. But the thing is, too, is I don't think he's lost the locker room, right? If there was a guy that people are going to point to and point the finger at of why the Giants may not be that good this season, is not because of Brian Daboll. It's because of the coordinator they brought in, and that's Shane Bowen. And that is one of the criticisms that you can have for Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll is their evaluation on Shane Bowen. But there wasn't a lot out there, I don't think. I think they kind of had to settle with Bowen, and you're not going to fire him mid-season because there's no one else to call defensive plays. So the big thing, right, is they can move on from him this year and get a new defensive coordinator and hopefully someone that can, keep this identity together, because Kayvon Thibodeau is not going anywhere. Abdul Carter, they just took in the previous draft at 3rd overall. Brian Burns has looked like a defensive player of the year candidate. I think he's on pace for 20-something sacks this season. So to see that is obviously very nice. And then Dexter Lawrence, who's received a bunch of criticism throughout the media and everybody because he's not playing like, Dexter Lawrence, even though they don't realize that he's been double-teamed at the highest percentage of any nose tackle in the NFL. So that's the big issue that I do have with the media and, people who talk about this football team, is sometimes they throw the coach under the bus and then they look at it and then they see who we're going to hire next. Who is going to be the next guy in charge for the New York Giants. And then if you fire the head coach, then you have to be on a general manager search, because they're not going to only fire one. And I do think that's how John Mara sees his team, is that he sees them as a dual package. And I'm not saying I know that, inside the locker room or inside the, general manager's office. But I think that's true. I think that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll are going to stay. And you could say all you want of how they handled Daniel Jones or how they handled Saquon or how they handled some of the other things, maybe Xavier McKinney, anything like that. The fact of the matter is that I still think this is a good defense on paper. I do. And I think it's really led held back from Shane Bowen. And I'm going to be critical of him in this entire episode, of a guy that probably should be let go is Shane Bowen, because this team, what did I say at the start of the season? The way that the Giants are going to be able to make the playoffs or win a lot of football games is their identity. And the identity that they're building is this defensive line with Carter, Thibs, Burns, and Lawrence, right? That is the big identity. The defensive line, the run defense has not been good. They still allow a decent amount of points, good amount of points. When they play prevent late in games, they've lost, two games that come to mind: the Dallas game and the Broncos game, of letting up, a ton of points in the fourth quarter and losing that football game, and then letting Brandon Aubrey kick a 60-plus yarder and think he's going to miss in a dome. He was never missing that kick. So just a few reasons of why Shane Bowen is probably not going to be on this football team very much longer. And it sucks that we're, basically saying the season is kind of over in October, even though it's October 30th, heading into November. And yeah, it's been very bad. But let's get into Joe Schoen, and then I'll get into more Brian Daboll, because I think I've talked about Brian Daboll more than Joe Schoen. Joe Schoen, the way that I think people view some of his cons is some of the free agents that he's signed, and just the free agent classes, and then the draft classes, right? I think those are the two spots that people look at and say Joe Schoen is not a good general manager, right? The big thing that I look at it too is that he had to inherit a terrible cap space with what Dave Gettleman gave him. The things that Dave Gettleman essentially gave him heading into the 2022 season that were like the good impact players was Saquon Barkley, Dexter Lawrence, Xavier McKinney, and Andrew Thomas, right? What is that? 4 players, right? Barkley, Lawrence, X, Saquon. Lawrence, Barkley, X, and then Andrew Thomas. There we go. You can't build a superstar team with that. And, I mean, luckily the Giants were able to win games because their defense, held their own, and their offense was pretty average. And that's what the Giants were. The Giants were an average offense that won a ton of close games, and if you flip-flop that, they would be a bad football team, and they wouldn't have made the playoffs, right? There was so many one-score games that the Giants were able to pull out. And you could thank their defense a lot of the times. I mean, the Ravens game, with the Thibs strip sack and a bunch of other games, right? That one just comes to my mind first because that was, a huge game, right? You beat Lamar Jackson. Lamar Jackson at the time didn't lose to any NFC teams. And then Daniel Jones, out of all quarterbacks, were able to, lock in a win against Lamar Jackson and that team. So, getting back to Joe Schoen, right? He's starting to get better players slowly. And I know, the NFL is a quick league, right? It's week to week, but it's also what are they doing now and what do we think they're going to bring next season, heading into the following season. What do we have, right? What you have for the Giants right now is a franchise quarterback potential in Jackson Dart. But we're going to say he's our franchise quarterback because of how he's played so far in a little sample size, right? When Cam Scatterbo does return, you do have a good running back. But don't forget about Tyron Tracy, right? I feel like people put all of their energy into Cam Scatterbo because of all the energy he brings and all the hits and all the CTE comments and all that. And just how he plays the game, right? He kind of plays it like a linebacker where he's just going to run through your face, basically. But, Tyron Tracy had 1,000-plus purpose yards last year, receiving and, rushing. So that is another thing that's also a Joe Schoen pick that I think, later round, good pick. I know he's a bit on the, other side of age, but that's still a good draft pick, right? And I think the problem is that so many people look at the players who are not in this league anymore, but they don't, they kind of forget of what, Joe Schoen is slowly building. It's a slow process, right? But what he's building is an identity with Dexter Lawrence, Brian Burns, Abdul Carter, Kayvon Thibodeau. And I don't think he's trading Kayvon. I don't think it would be very smart to trade Kayvon either. That's another thing that's going through the media. Got to trade Thibodeau. You got to get him as the highest value, all of this. He's a good player. You can't just trade good players and expect to find another Kayvon Thibodeau, in the draft. But obviously that could happen because, rookies coming out of college could be, a freak athlete. And, we've seen that. We've seen the edge rushers over the past 5+ seasons just be absolutely dominant, right? TJ Watt, Max Crosby, Parsons, Myles Garrett, all of those guys, right? And that is the big thing that I do like that Joe Schoen is building. And it's, he knows that there are a bunch of other positions of need, right? Wide receiver is definitely one. Even when Malik Neighbors comes back, I think he needs a little bit more. I think he needs another wide receiver, in my opinion. I have not been very high on Darius Slayton. That is one of the other cons I do have of Joe Schoen, is that sometimes we kind of just threw out money to players that I think we could have moved on from. I think we could have moved on from Darius Slayton. I do think that we could have used money in another way. I think he's kept Evan Neal, Jalen Hyatt way too long on this team. And somehow I'm seeing that Jalen Hyatt has injury reports. I don't know what he's done that he gets injured. I don't know if it's stubbing his toe in the locker room or I don't know what it is. Evan Neal doesn't even dress. So the fact that those two guys haven't been traded yet, maybe they're waiting until the trade deadline, but their value isn't going to change. So, or it's a depth issue because the Giants have had some issues, and Slayton went down for a few weeks, right? Malik Neighbors is out for the season, so maybe that's why they're holding on to Jalen Hyatt. Not really too sure. But listen, I've been very critical of Joe Schoen, but the more I look at it, I don't see a world where they fire him and they hire someone else right now. I don't. And I know it's going to be something that people, because it's a kicker issue. They don't, believe in kickers. And, I get it. These two guys make a lot of mistakes. I get it. We're in, year 4, right? But this is year 1 to me because Jackson Dart is your guy now. You went through the Daniel Jones experiment. Nothing really clicked. Wasn't in the right system, clearly, as we've seen what he's done with Indianapolis. So there's that. Right now we're rebuilding, but for a different reason. We're rebuilding for Jackson Dart, right? We know Jackson Dart is going to need weapons in his career. We know Malik Neighbors is eventually going to be back, and Cam Scatterby is going to be eventually back. And when those two guys are back, I, expect a very nice, offense. I think even with what Jackson Dart has had, he's been pretty explosive, man. I mean, I look at that Eagles game, this past week. I thought he looked very good, and he's putting the ball in the hands, and it's either a Theo Johnson drop or, not to throw Theo Johnson under the bus, but he's had a lot of drops that, Jackson Dart could have had. And, the overall thing is the penalties and the drops. But, the other thing, too, that I wanted to touch on is, like I said, with the locker room. The only person is Shane Bowen that the players, I think, don't like. I think they got a lot of respect for Dabes. I know the media. Here's the other thing with the media. The media is going to take something and blow it way out of proportion. It was something with training camp about how they, it's very laid back. I've seen Brian Daboll's energy before. I've seen clips of it. In no way, shape, or mind that I think this is a poorly run training camp. I don't. And listen, I'm not there, so you could take that as you don't know what you're talking about. You're not there. But I don't know. I see Brian Daboll as a guy that wants to win. He's a competitor. He sees the frustration after losses. You see it. You see him slamming the headset and all that. But at the end of the day, he just wants to win. And he wants to have a team that has a quarterback that they can gel off of and play well and win football games that maybe people doubt him in. Right? I don't think people had a lot of them winning that Chargers game against Justin Herbert. Jackson Dart came in and played a really good football game, right? And I mean, You look at some other games, I think, you look at it now, right? I think one of the big questions now is that if you started Jackson Dart week 1, what would the Giants' record look like? And now I think that is definitely something else that has been blown out of proportion from the media and all of the main networks, because they wanted Jackson Dart to start so quickly. So quickly. Let's start in week 1. Let's bench Russell Wilson. What was the point of signing Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston? To develop Jackson Dart. Did you have to sign both of them? Probably not. You probably could have ran with Jameis Winston for the first 3 weeks, and then you start him against the Chargers, and then you play against the Eagles, and then the Broncos, and then the Eagles again. So that's where I have it on that. The other issue as well is, trying to not yawn for you guys, but it is still early in the morning when I'm recording this. The other issue too is they're so close. They are so close to winning football games, man. The Jackson Dart game against the Broncos, bad interception leads to a loss, leads to momentum shift. Right. The Dallas game, you lose by a field goal in overtime. Right. Washington, you just weren't prepared. You weren't good enough. You lost 21-6. Realistically, you lost 14-6. Last minute touchdown. But, the other issue is yes, have I been critical of Daboll? Have I been critical of Schoen? 100%. I posted a video probably last season or 2023 that these guys got to go. And that was the impatient of me of, saying we should fire them. And that's what the media is telling us. That is what some other people are saying, that the Giants should move on. You can't. This is Daboll's guy. You got to give him a chance with Daboll and Dart. And if you want to keep Mike Kafka, keep Mike Kafka. The worst thing you could do is fire these two and let another regime look at Dart and say, yep, that's not our guy, but we'll take it. He's our quarterback. And that's the issue. And then there's always that back conversation that says, well, if we fired him, a whole new regime could have done the process and did all that. John Mara is lazy. Why do you think the Jets and Giants have been so bad? It's because their owners are so lazy and they only care about the money, man. They only care about the money. And that is the issue. Is we need an owner, which obviously is not going to change anytime soon. You need a motivator, man. You need a motivator. You need a guy that is going to do more for this team and not just collect money and throw out a fan day, here's a medium Pepsi. We don't need that. We need wins. We need a winning football team. It seems like the energy is looking better. I'll say that. I think the energy is looking better. Look at that preseason to now. It was better. But yeah, I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up, personally. Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll, they're going to stay. Sorry for the little clickbait if you guys have made it all the way to this, spot. But that's going to do it for this video. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.